Elijah Cross was 38 years old the morning his wife looked at him across their kitchen table and told him he had wasted the best years of her life. He was wearing a navy work shirt with his name stitched above the breast pocket. He was drinking coffee he had made himself at 5:15 in the morning, the way he made it every morning. 1 scoop measured, water filtered, no shortcuts. He had placed a second cup on Simone's side of the table before she came downstairs, the way he had done for 9 years of marriage. The cup was still sitting there, untouched and cooling, when she said what she said. "You have nothing to show for yourself, Elijah. You manage other people's trucks. You sit in a dispatch office and you watch the world move while you stand still. Trent built something. You are still waiting for permission to begin." He did not respond. He looked at his coffee. Simone pulled the wedding band from her left hand with a single practiced motion, the way a person removes something they have been planning to remove for some time. She set it on the table between them, not dropped it. Set it, with a quiet finality that was somehow worse than throwing it. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the door. That was a Thursday. What Simone did not know, what she had never once asked about in 9 years of marriage, was that the black Escalade sitting in their driveway, the one she had called a company lease more times than he could count, belonged to him. So did the company. So did 16 others like it, spread across 4 states, moving 340,000 freight units per quarter under contracts that kept hospitals stocked, retailers supplied, and distribution centers running on time. She had called him a man who watched the world move while he stood still. She had no idea whose name was on the building the world moved through. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. East Nashville in late October had a particular quality of light in the early mornings, low and amber, coming in sideways through the gap between houses on Shelby Avenue, catching the surface of things and holding them for a moment before the day started moving too fast to notice. Elijah noticed. He always had. He had bought the house on Cahal Avenue 7 years earlier, when the neighborhood was still in the middle of becoming what it was trying to be. Before the coffee shops arrived on every corner, before the renovated bungalows started selling at prices that made longtime residents quietly furious. He had paid cash for a property that needed work, and he had done most of that work himself over the course of a long winter. The wraparound porch was his from the ground up. The posts he had set in poured footings, the decking he had laid board by board on a series of cold Saturday mornings. The ceiling he had painted a particular shade of blue that his mother, Ruth Cross, had called "haint blue," and said kept bad spirits from settling in. Ruth Cross had passed 4 years earlier, 3 weeks after her 61st birthday, from a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed too long, because she had spent most of her adult life more concerned with whether Elijah had eaten than with whether her own blood pressure was under control. She had raised him in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Nashville after his father left. Working dispatch herself, first at a laundry service, then at a regional courier company, then at a small freight brokerage, where she had learned more about logistics operations than most people with 4-year degrees ever absorbed. She used to say, "The load doesn't care who's carrying it. What matters is whether it gets there." Elijah had built his company on that principle. He had also built it quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely out of sight. Cross Meridian Logistics had started as a single truck and a fuel card 10 years ago. When Elijah was 28 and working days as an operations coordinator for a regional carrier, while running his own contracts on nights and weekends. He had not borrowed money from anyone. He had not taken on partners. He had grown the network one contract at a time, learning the routes, understanding the margins, identifying the inefficiencies that larger carriers ignored because they were too small to matter and too widespread to track. By the time he married Simone, Cross Meridian was operating 11 vehicles across Tennessee and Kentucky. By the time she set her ring on the kitchen table, it was operating 63, under contracts that included 2 national retail chains, a regional hospital network, and a third-party logistics agreement with a distributor whose name appeared on half the loading docks in the Southeast. The holding structure, Cross Meridian LLC, housed inside a parent entity called Cahal Group, had been established with the help of a Nashville business attorney before Elijah and Simone were engaged. It was not a secret in the sinister sense. It was private in the way that serious business is always private. Documented, legal, structured, and not discussed with people who had not asked to be part of it. Simone had never asked. In the early months of their marriage, she had accepted his long hours with the understanding that he was building toward something. Then, as the years passed, she had reframed those hours as evidence that he was going nowhere. She saw the work shirts. She saw the dispatch calls he took at 6 in the morning and the route reviews he conducted on Sunday afternoons. She saw the Escalade, which carried no company branding, which she had once pointed at in the driveway and said, "I hope they at least cover the insurance on that thing." And she saw a man whose ambition had topped out at middle management. Trent Holloway had appeared 14 months ago, when Simone joined the events and hospitality division of Landmark Group, a Nashville-based venue and event management company. Trent was their regional director of operations, polished, well-traveled, the kind of man who spoke about his work the way people speak about art. He wore his success on the outside, which Simone had begun to read as evidence that success was supposed to look a certain way. Elijah had noticed the shift in her language first, phrases that sounded borrowed, opinions about ambition that had the cadence of someone else's conviction. He had noted them and said nothing. He was in logistics. He understood that some cargo shifted in transit. The first concrete signal had arrived 6 weeks before the kitchen table morning. Elijah had been reviewing security footage from a warehouse property he owned off Murfreesboro Pike, a 40,000 square foot facility that Cross Meridian leased back through the Cahal Group structure, keeping the ownership arm clean and the operating arm flexible. The camera on the east exterior captured the parking lot and the street beyond. On a Wednesday evening in September, at 7:14 p.m., a silver BMW that Elijah did not recognize had idled in the lot for 22 minutes. He had not thought much of it then. 3 weeks later, reviewing the same footage for a separate reason, he had noticed the same car in the same spot, a different Wednesday, 7:41 p.m. He ran the plate through a contact that he had in the carrier compliance network. The vehicle was registered to a leasing company. The lessee was Trent Holloway. Elijah had looked at that name on his screen for a long moment. Then he had opened his thermos, poured a cup, and begun tracing backward through the previous 4 months of Simone's calendar. The shared one they maintained for household logistics. The one she used to note her late evenings and her travel days. There were 11 entries marked client dinner or off-site event in the past 4 months. Cross-referencing them against Trent Holloway's publicly listed speaking appearances and Landmark Group's public event calendar, Elijah found that 9 of those 11 evenings corresponded to dates when Trent was confirmed to be in Nashville and not at a scheduled company event. He had not confronted her. He had not opened her phone. He had simply looked at the records that were available to a man who paid attention, and he had let the pattern speak at its own pace. His hands had not shaken once. He built a folder. He documented dates. He cross-referenced the joint account statements. Simone managed the household expenses, and he had not reviewed them carefully in 2 years, which he acknowledged to himself as an oversight. When he did review them now, He found $53,000 in charges over 16 months that he could not match to any household expense he recognized. Hotel stays in a city she had told him she wasn't visiting. Restaurant charges on evenings she had described as quiet nights at the office, and 3 charges from a luxury weekend resort in Franklin, Tennessee. On a weekend, Elijah had been in Memphis for a carrier compliance review. He had photographed every statement. He had created a secondary folder. He had forwarded everything to a private email address that had existed for exactly this kind of record. Then he had called Nadine. Nadine Okafor had practiced family and business law in Nashville for 27 years. She was 54, wore her natural hair short and silver, and had a reputation in the legal community for being the attorney that other attorneys recommended when a case involved both a marriage and a corporation, and the lines between them needed to be drawn with precision. She had helped Elijah structure the Kahal Group entity when he was 31. She knew exactly what he had built and exactly how it was documented. She listened to everything he said without interrupting. When he finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk. "You have been carrying this alone for 6 weeks." "Yes." "And she still does not know about Cross Meridian or the Kahal structure?" "She has never asked. Not in 9 years." Nadine looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who had heard many versions of this story and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. "What do you want the outcome to be?" "I want a separation filed on accurate terms. I want the corporate assets properly classified as separate property. And I want to understand what exposure, if any, Simone has created through the joint account if those charges were made to cover something that involved her employer." Nadine was quiet for a moment. "That last part is interesting." Elijah nodded. Landmark Group has a conflict of interest policy for employees in operational roles. If Trent Holloway has been using company resources to fund personal activity, and Simone has been a participant, that is a human resources matter that could become a legal one. Nadine made a note. "How did you learn about the policy?" "I read it. It's on their website. I'm in logistics. I read policies." She almost smiled. Then she opened a new file on her desk and began writing. "A load properly documented cannot be disputed at the delivery point." Elijah's mother had said something close to that once, standing over a manifest at the brokerage where she'd worked. And it had lodged in him the way the most useful things always do, not as advice you remember consciously, but as a habit you practice without thinking. He would have the documentation before he made a single move. 4 days passed. Elijah went to work. He reviewed route efficiency reports, approved 2 new carrier contracts, and walked the Murfreesboro Pike warehouse on a Tuesday morning to assess a loading bay reconfiguration he'd been planning since spring. He wore his Navy work shirt. He drove the Escalade. He spoke to his dispatch coordinator, to his operations manager, and to 3 drivers who had questions about a new route rollout. Not one person on his team would have described him as troubled that week. That was not avoidance. It was discipline. He had learned, over 10 years of building a logistics company from a single truck, that the most dangerous mistakes were made by people who let emotion dictate timing. He came home each evening. Simone was there on 2 of those 4 nights. She was courteous in the hollow, managed way of a person who has already made a decision and is waiting for the world to catch up with it. She asked about his day. He answered. She made herself tea. He read. Neither of them spoke about the kitchen table, the ring, or what she had said. On the 3rd evening, he kissed her cheek before bed. She paused, barely, just a fraction of a second, and then accepted it. He noted it without expression and went to sleep. His uncle Calvin called the next morning. Calvin Cross was 63, a retired long-haul driver who had known Elijah since birth and had been the first person outside Nadine's office who understood the full scope of what his nephew had built. He had learned about it by accident 4 years earlier, when he had driven Elijah to a facility signing in Memphis and read the name on the building. "That your name on that door?" he had asked. "Yes, sir." Calvin had looked at the building for a long moment. "Your mama would have something to say about that." "I know." He called now from Memphis, where he was visiting his daughter. "I heard from Simone. She says you two are separating and that you're not handling it well." Elijah poured his morning coffee. "When did she call you?" "Yesterday. She wanted me to talk some sense into you." Calvin paused. "I told her I'd think about it." "Don't. I wasn't planning to." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it Holloway?" "Yes." Another pause. "I saw him once, at that landmark event you went to in the spring. He spent 45 minutes talking about himself in the third person." Elijah almost laughed. "I need you to stay clear of it, Calvin. The records are doing the work. They always do." "You got that from your mama, I know." Calvin was quiet for a beat. "She used to say a root can't lie. You just have to follow it all the way back." Elijah looked at the folder on his desk. He was following it. After the call, he received a message from Nadine. Her investigative contact had completed a review of Landmark Group's internal expense platform, accessible through a compliance document subpoena that Nadine had been quietly authorized to initiate based on the joint account irregularities. The review had surfaced something that changed the weight of the situation considerably. Trent Holloway had expensed 11 of the hotel stays and restaurant charges, the same ones that appeared in Elijah and Simone's joint account, through Landmark Group's event hospitality budget. They were categorized as client entertainment. Several of them bore a secondary approval signature. Simone Cross, Events Marketing Manager. She had been approving her own shared expenses as corporate entertainment charges. Elijah read the document once. Then he read it again. This was no longer only a marriage that had run past its honest end. This was a paper trail that could reach Simone's employment record, her professional standing, and her legal exposure, all of which, if she had thought any of it through, she might have considered before she set her ring on the kitchen table and called him a man who had never built anything worth having. He called Nadine. "Expand the filing," he said, "and contact Landmark's HR director." The reckoning arrived on a Friday. Elijah knew it was going to happen at her office. Not because he had planned it as a dramatic gesture. He was not a man who staged scenes, but because the documentation demanded it. Landmark Group's HR director had requested a meeting with Simone that morning to review the expense irregularities that Nadine's subpoena had surfaced. Nadine had been invited to attend in her capacity as counsel for the injured party in the related civil matter. Elijah had been asked to provide a statement. He drove the Escalade. He drove it because it was his vehicle. He drove it because it was practical and reliable, and had 94,000 miles on it, and had never once failed to start. He drove it because Simone had called it a company lease in the driveway of their home no fewer than a dozen times. And because there was a particular kind of clarity that arrived when you stopped explaining yourself and simply showed up as what you were. He parked in the front visitor space of the Landmark Group building on Commerce Street, downtown Nashville, at 9:47 in the morning. He did not know that Simone was standing at her office window on the 3rd floor when the black Escalade pulled into the lot. He did not know that Trent Holloway, who was at that moment exiting the building through the main lobby doors on his way to a breakfast meeting, had stopped on the sidewalk and gone very still when he saw the vehicle. He did not know that 3 of Simone's colleagues, women she had worked with for 14 months, women who had listened to her describe her husband in the specific, diminishing language of a person trying to make a decision feel inevitable, were watching from the lobby window as the door opened, and Elijah stepped out in his dark jacket and his worn boots, carrying a leather folder under one arm. He simply walked through the front doors and gave his name at the reception desk. The receptionist looked at her screen. She looked up. She picked up her phone and said something quietly. Then she looked back at him. "Mr. Cross, you can go up. 3rd floor, conference room B." He thanked her and took the elevator. Simone was already in the conference room when he arrived. She sat on one side of the table with her hands folded, wearing the charcoal blazer she put on when she wanted to feel professionally armored. Nadine sat on the opposite side, flanked by Landmark's HR director, a careful woman named Phoebe Garrett, and a compliance attorney from Landmark's outside counsel. A recording device sat in the center of the table. Everything was formal. Everything had been arranged before Elijah walked in, and Simone's expression told him she had not expected him to be part of it. He sat beside Nadine without speaking. Trent Holloway entered 2 minutes later. He had not been told Elijah would be present. He stopped in the doorway for just a fraction of a second, long enough for the hesitation to be visible, then entered and took the remaining chair beside Landmark's HR attorney. Phoebe Garrett opened the session. She was thorough and unhurried. She presented the expense records first, 11 charges, totaling $38,400, categorized as client entertainment and approved through the event's marketing budget. She placed the approval documentation on the table, Simone's digital signature visible beneath each charge. Simone looked at the papers. These were pre-approved categories. Trent told me they qualified as regional partnership development expenses. Phoebe looked at her without judgment. Were the events in question attended by Landmark clients? Simone did not answer immediately. Was any company business conducted at these locations? The question sat in the air. Trent leaned forward. The events marketing team has broad discretion in categorizing relationship-building activities. Phoebe turned to him. The events in question did not appear on any Landmark client calendar, internal event log, or activity report for the relevant dates. She paused. They do appear in Mr. Cross's personal banking records as joint account charges made by his wife on the same dates and at the same locations. The room shifted. Simone looked at Trent. He was looking at the table. She looked at the expense records in front of her, and Elijah could see, in the careful, controlled movement of her eyes across the page, the moment she understood how completely she had been positioned. Her signature was on every approval. Trent's name appeared as the initiating executive on only 3 of them. The paper trail, as it had been assembled, showed a pattern that ran through her hand. She reached into the folder beside her and removed her own documents. Message threads she had preserved from Trent, messages in which he had described the charges as standard practice, had promised her that regional entertainment spend was never reviewed below a certain threshold, had told her that her approval was a formality. She placed them on the table. "This was what he told me," she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something to maintain. Trent looked at the printed messages. "Those are private communications. You told me to approve them." Her jaw tightened. "You told me it was standard. I told you entertainment spend was flexible. You chose how to categorize it." The room was very quiet for a moment. Nadine opened the folder in front of her. She placed 4 documents on the table. The first was the original Articles of Organization for Cross Meridian Logistics, LLC, filed 10 years earlier, listing Elijah Cross as sole member and managing operator. The second was the operating agreement for Cahal Group, LLC, the parent holding entity. Elijah's name was the only name in the signatory section. Simone's name did not appear. The third was a current valuation summary prepared by Cross Meridian's accounting firm. Total enterprise value as of the most recent fiscal year, $288 million across 63 vehicles, 4 state operating authorities, and active contracts with 11 commercial clients. The fourth was a one-page certification from Nadine's office, confirming that all corporate assets were established as separate property prior to and maintained independently throughout the marriage, with no commingling of marital funds. Simone looked at the documents. She looked at them the way a person looks at a map when they have just understood that they have been navigating from the wrong starting point. Her eyes came up to Elijah's face. "That Escalade," she said. Her voice was almost quiet. "Belongs to me, along with 15 others." She shook her head slowly, not in denial, in the particular motion of a person reassembling a picture from pieces that have just rearranged themselves. "You let me believe. I let you see what was true," Elijah said. "I drove a work truck. I wore a work shirt. I managed operations, because I am an operations man, and that is what operations men do." He looked at her steadily. "You decided what those things meant." "I did not make that decision for you. You should have told me." Nadine spoke before Elijah could. "The Kahal Group structure was established before your engagement and has been maintained independently throughout the marriage in accordance with Tennessee separate property law. There was no legal obligation to disclose private corporate holdings to a spouse who had no ownership interest. The disclosure you are receiving today is a courtesy extended as part of the divorce filing, which was initiated this morning." Simone's head turned toward Elijah. "You filed already?" "This morning." She pressed her lips together. Her hands were flat on the table. Trent had not spoken in several minutes. He was looking at the valuation summary with an expression Elijah recognized. A man doing rapid arithmetic about how a situation had become something other than what he had planned. Phoebe Garrett addressed the compliance findings. Landmark Group's outside counsel had reviewed the expense records and the message threads Simone had produced. The preliminary determination was that the charges had been incorrectly categorized and that the approval process had been misrepresented to the approving employee by the initiating executive. Trent Holloway's employment was suspended pending formal investigation. Simone's role would be reviewed separately in light of the documentation she had voluntarily produced. Trent stood. "This is a coordinated attack." Nadine looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard many people describe documented facts as attacks. "The records were produced through a lawful compliance subpoena," she said. "They are what they are. She orchestrated this." He pointed at Simone. "She kept those messages to use against me." Simone looked at him for a long moment. "You told me my name would be on the national expansion. You told me this was how careers were built." Trent's voice dropped. "You signed every page, because you told me it was clean." The two of them looked at each other across the table with a particular expression of people who have just understood that they place their weight on the same unsteady beam and are both going down. Phoebe Garrett ended the meeting with a series of formal statements. Trent's access badge was collected by building security in the lobby. The charges would be referred to outside counsel. Simone was placed on administrative leave while the review of her approvals continued, with the note in the record that her voluntary production of the message threads would be considered in the determination of intent. The room emptied in stages. Compliance attorneys left first. HR followed. Trent walked out without looking back. Simone remained. She and Elijah were the last two people at the table. Nadine had stepped into the hallway to take a call. Simone looked at the valuation summary on the table in front of her. $288 million, she said, almost to herself. Elijah did not respond to that. She looked at him. "I called you a failure." "Yes." "I said you had nothing to show for yourself?" "Yes." Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. "How long?" 10 years. Cross Meridian started the year before we met. She absorbed that, all those mornings, all those dispatch calls, the routes you reviewed on Sundays. That is what running a logistics network looks like from the inside, Elijah said. It does not look like what Trent Holloway looks like. It looks like work. Simone covered her mouth briefly. Then she lowered her hand. I was wrong about you. He held her gaze. You were wrong about what mattered. He let a moment pass. And I am sorry that it took what it took for you to understand that. But I am not the lesson you needed to learn. He was. She looked toward the door Trent had walked out of. Then she looked back at the table, at the corporate documents that had rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. There was nothing left to argue. There was nothing left to offer. The records had said everything that needed to be said, in the language that could not be reinterpreted or reframed. Elijah gathered his documents. He stood. The ring, Simone said. He looked at her. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and placed their wedding band on the table between them. She had retrieved it from the kitchen table that same Thursday morning, after she had driven away and then, apparently, driven back. She had been carrying it since. He looked at it for a moment. The small gold band they had chosen together at a jeweler on Fifth Avenue North, on a budget that had seemed like enough at the time, and that he could now have multiplied by 100 without pausing. It had represented what they were building. It represented now what she had been willing to put down. He left it on the table. The load, his mother used to say, tells you everything about the carrier. Not what they claim to be carrying, what they actually put down when it got heavy. He picked up his folder. He nodded to Simone with the courtesy of a man who has fully closed an account and has no further business at the window. Then he walked out of the conference room, down the corridor, and into the elevator. The lobby was quiet. The receptionist looked up as he passed. Through the glass front doors, the black Escalade sat in the visitor space where he had parked it, exactly where he had left it, unhurried and solid in the late morning sun. He pushed through the doors and walked to it. He did not look back at the third-floor window. He got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot onto Commerce Street, heading east toward the warehouse on Murfreesboro Pike, where 63 vehicles were running routes across 4 states, and where the work that had always been his was waiting, exactly as he had left it. 11 months later, the porch on Cahal Avenue had a new chair. Elijah had built it himself from reclaimed oak he had sourced from a demolition site in Germantown, the kind of dense, close-grained old-growth wood that did not exist in hardware stores anymore, that required patience to find and care to work with. He had built the chair over 3 evenings in early September, using hand tools, no hurry, and the particular satisfaction of a man who makes things with his hands, not because he has to, but because it keeps him honest about what he can do. Cross Meridian had completed its first national retail contract that spring, a last-mile delivery agreement with a chain whose name appeared on storefronts in 31 states. The contract required a fleet expansion across 2 new operating regions, and Elijah had delivered the presentation himself, in his Navy work shirt and his plain watch, to a procurement committee that had expected someone in a suit. They awarded the contract anyway. The numbers were better than anything a suit had brought them. Trent Holloway resigned from Landmark Group before the formal investigation concluded. The expense irregularities were referred to outside counsel and resulted in a civil recovery action. He had taken a position at a smaller firm in Knoxville, where a title and a silver watch were learning what they were worth without someone else's infrastructure beneath them. Simone had been cleared of intentional misconduct, given the documentation she produced. Her administrative leave ended. She accepted a lateral transfer to a quieter division, less visibility, less pressure, which seemed to be what she needed. The divorce finalized through Nadine's office without litigation. The corporate assets remained as they were, separate, documented, undisputed. On a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the kitchen table, Elijah sat on the porch on Cahal Avenue in the new chair and drank his coffee and watched the light come in sideways off Shelby Avenue, the way it always did at that hour. The haint blue ceiling above him caught the early sky and held it. A woman named Harriet, who taught civil engineering at Vanderbilt and lived 2 streets over, had joined him for coffee on Sunday mornings twice in the past month. She had knocked on his door the first time to ask whether he knew anything about load calculations for a timber frame outbuilding she was planning, because someone in the neighborhood had told her he was the person to ask about things like that. He had known quite a lot. She had come back the following Sunday with a set of sketches and a question about lateral bracing. And they had talked for 2 hours on the porch while the neighborhood woke up around them. He liked that she asked real questions and waited for real answers. The Escalade sat in the driveway, 96,000 miles now, due for new tires in the spring. He had already ordered them. The load doesn't care who's carrying it, his mother used to say. What matters is whether it gets there. It was getting there. Elijah finished his coffee, set the cup on the arm of the new chair, and watched the morning arrive over East Nashville. He had nowhere to be for another 45 minutes. He stayed right where he was. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.